The entire ballroom fell silent when Marcus Whitmore, the billionaire tech mogul, walked through the grand entrance of the Rosewood estate with a woman on his arm who didn't belong in their world. Or so everyone thought, tanned when the groom himself rushed forward and dropped to one knee, calling her boss in front of 300 elite guests. The carefully constructed walls of privilege and prejudice began to crumble in ways no one could have anticipated. It started 3 weeks earlier, on a rainy Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago, when Marcus sat in his corner office on the 40th floor, staring at the gilded invitation to his younger sister Victoria's wedding, feeling the familiar weight of family expectations pressing down on his chest like an anchor dragging him into dark waters he'd spent years trying to escape. Victoria had always been the golden child, the one who followed their parents' blueprint, perfectly Yale degree, marriage to a successful hedge fund manager named Preston Aldrich III, a life mapped out in country clubs and charity galas where donations mattered more than the causes themselves, while Marcus, despite building a tech empire worth billions, had always been the disappointment because he'd done it his way, hiring people based on merit rather than pedigree, giving second chances to those society had written off, and refusing to join the family's exclusive social circle that measured worth in surnames and stock portfolios. His assistant knocked gently, interrupting his thoughts, reminding him about the afternoon meeting at the Bright Futures Community Center, a nonprofit he'd been quietly funding for years. And as he gathered his things, Marcus had no idea that this routine visit would change everything. The community center sat in a neighborhood his family would never visit, where hope fought daily battles against hardship, and when Marcus walked through the doors, he was greeted not with the reverence his wealth usually commanded, but with genuine warmth from people who knew him simply as Mr. M, the man who believed in their programs. That's when he saw her, Grace Coleman, a 48-year-old woman with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a simple bun, wearing a modest blue cardigan over a floral dress, sitting at a table with 5 teenagers, her hands moving expressively as she talked about Shakespeare with the kind of passion that made literature live and breathe. Marcus found himself drawn to the classroom doorway, watching as Grace transformed Romeo and Juliet from dusty required reading into a story about real people making impossible choices. And when one student, a boy named Deshaun, with a guarded expression, asked why anyone should care about people who'd been dead for 400 years, Grace's response stopped Marcus in his tracks. Because pain and love and hope don't have expiration dates, baby, she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of lived experience. These stories remind us that what we feel matters, that our struggles aren't new, and that humans have been finding ways to survive heartbreak and injustice for thousands of years. And if they could make it through their storms, so can we. Marcus felt something crack open in his chest, a feeling he couldn't name, and after the class ended, he introduced himself properly, though Grace already knew who he was, not as Marcus Whitmore, billionaire, but as the man whose donations had kept the center's arts program alive when budget cuts threatened to kill the one thing many of these kids loved. They talked for 2 hours, sitting in the center's small cafeteria over terrible vending machine coffee, and Marcus found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone, how he felt like a fraud at family gatherings, how his wealth had built walls between him and genuine human connection, how he sometimes missed the struggling version of himself who'd built his first computer in a cramped apartment, because at least back then he'd known who his real friends were. Grace listened without judgment, her warm brown eyes seeing past the expensive suit to the lonely man underneath. And then she shared her own story, how she'd been a high school English teacher for 22 years, until budget cuts eliminated her position, how she'd lost her husband to cancer 3 years ago, how she'd poured her grief into volunteering at the community center, because these kids needed to know that someone believed in them unconditionally. Money can't buy what you have, Marcus said quietly, and Grace smiled, a sad, knowing smile that suggested she understood exactly what he meant. "And all the love in the world can't pay my rent," she replied gently, not with bitterness, but with the practical wisdom of someone who'd learned to live with life's unfairness. "We all have our struggles, Mr. Whitmore. Yours just look different than mine." Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus found excuses to return to the community center, ostensibly to check on programs and meet with directors, but really to sit in on Grace's classes, to watch her transform young lives with nothing but attention, high expectations, and unconditional belief in their potential. He learned that she took the bus 90 minutes each way to volunteer 3 days a week, that she supplemented her modest pension by tutoring neighborhood kids at her small apartment, that she'd never owned a car or taken a vacation in 5 years. Yet, she possessed a richness of spirit that made his penthouse feel like a mausoleum of expensive emptiness. One evening, as they shared pizza with a group of students celebrating the end of their poetry unit, an idea struck Marcus with the force of revelation. He would ask Grace to accompany him to Victoria's wedding, not as some pretty woman-style project, or to prove a point, but because in 2 weeks she'd become the most genuine friend he'd had in years. And he wanted her there to remind him who he really was, beneath the expectations and pretense. When he asked her the next day, stumbling over his words like a nervous teenager, Grace's first response was to laugh, a warm, full-bodied sound that filled the empty classroom. "Mr. Whitmore, I don't belong in that world," she said kindly, but Marcus shook his head, his voice urgent, with an emotion he was only beginning to understand. "Neither do I, Grace. That's exactly why I need you there." She studied his face for a long moment, seeing something there that made her expression soften, and finally, she agreed, though she insisted she had nothing appropriate to wear to a billionaire's sister's wedding. Marcus wanted to offer to buy her a dress, but Grace's pride was a tangible thing. So instead he mentioned that his late mother had left behind a collection of classic gowns, in storage, never worn, and would Grace honor her memory by choosing one a white lie that allowed generosity to flow without wounding dignity. The day before the wedding, Grace arrived at Marcus's penthouse for the first time, her eyes wide as she took in the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, the modern art that costs more than most people earned in a lifetime. The vast spaces that echoed with expensive loneliness. Marcus's personal stylist, whom he'd briefed extensively about respect and simplicity, presented several elegant options, but Grace gravitated immediately to a simple black silk gown, classic and understated, with clean lines that spoke of timeless dignity rather than trendy flash. "This one," she said softly, running her hand over the fabric. "It's beautiful without trying too hard. I like that." The stylist, a woman named Claire who'd dressed celebrities and socialites for 20 years, found herself blinking back unexpected tears as she fitted the dress to Grace's frame, later telling Marcus that in 2 decades of working with wealthy clients, she'd never seen anyone wear anything with such natural grace. The wedding day arrived with crystalline autumn sunshine, and as Marcus's driver navigated the tree-lined road to the Rosewood estate, Grace sat quietly beside him, her hands folded in her lap, and Marcus noticed they were trembling slightly. "You okay?" he asked gently, and Grace nodded, though her voice was uncertain. "I just don't want to embarrass you," she admitted, and Marcus took her hand, surprising them both. "Grace, you couldn't embarrass me if you tried. You're the most real person I know, and that's exactly what this family needs to see." The estate was a monument to old money, all manicured gardens and classical architecture, and as they approached the entrance where other guests were arriving in designer gowns and tuxedos, Marcus felt Grace tense beside him. He slowed his pace, matching her rhythm, and together they walked into the grand foyer, where his mother, Constance Whitmore, stood receiving guests with the regal bearing of someone who'd been trained from birth to assess and categorize people within seconds. "Marcus, darling," Constance said, air-kissing her son's cheeks, before her gaze landed on Grace. And Marcus watched his mother's expression shift through a rapid sequence assessment, barely concealed disapproval. "Mother, I'd like you to meet Grace Coleman," Marcus said, his voice steady and proud. "Grace is a retired teacher and one of the most remarkable people I've ever met." Constance's smile never wavered, but it never reached her eyes either as she extended a limp hand. "How interesting," she said, the single word carrying volumes of unspoken judgment. "Marcus does have a talent for the unexpected." Grace shook her hand with quiet dignity, and Marcus felt a flash of anger at his mother's casual cruelty. But before he could respond, his sister Victoria appeared, radiant in her designer wedding gown, her eyes widening as she took in Grace's simple elegance. "Marcus," Victoria exclaimed, embracing her brother, before turning to Grace, with the practiced politeness of someone well-versed in social navigation. "Welcome. Any friend of Marcus's is welcome here." But Marcus could see the questions in his sister's eyes, the slight tightness around her mouth that suggested she was already calculating what the other guests would say. How this unexpected +1 might affect the carefully orchestrated perfection of her special day. The ceremony was held in the estate's gardens. 300 guests, seated in elegant rows, and Marcus and Grace were placed near the back, despite Marcus's family's subtle slight that spoke volumes about Constance's displeasure. Throughout the ceremony, Marcus watched Grace's face, seeing her eyes mist as Victoria and Preston exchanged vows, seeing her genuine happiness for two people she'd never met, and he felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that what he felt for this woman went deeper than friendship, though he wasn't ready to name it yet. The reception was held in the estate's grand ballroom, all crystal chandeliers and live orchestras, and Marcus noticed immediately how people's eyes followed Grace, heard the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when he approached, felt the weight of his family's social circle, assessing and finding her wanting based on nothing but her simple dress and humble bearing. Grace handled it all with quiet dignity, though Marcus saw the small signs of discomfort, the way she held her water glass like a shield, the slight stiffness in her smile, the careful way she navigated conversations with people who spoke to her with the patronizing kindness usually reserved for service staff. Then Preston's father, a red-faced man named Preston Aldridge Jr., who'd made his fortune in real estate and his reputation on cruelty, had too much champagne and decided to make Grace the target of his particular brand of humor. "So tell me, dear," he boomed across their table, his voice carrying two nearby guests, "how exactly does someone like you end up at an event like this? Are you with the catering staff?" The conversation around them died instantly, and Marcus felt fury flood his system. But before he could respond, Grace spoke, her voice calm and clear. "I'm here because Marcus invited me," she said simply, without defensiveness or shame, "and I'm grateful for his friendship." Preston Jr. laughed, a harsh sound that made Marcus's hands clench into fists. "Friendships, that's what we're calling it now," he said, his implication crude and unmistakable. And Marcus stood abruptly, ready to end this man regardless of consequences. But suddenly, Preston III, the groom himself, was there. His face pale and his eyes locked on Grace with an expression of shocked recognition. "Mrs. Coleman," Preston said, his voice cracking slightly, and the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath as the young hedge fund manager, the man who'd just married into one of Chicago's elite families, crossed the space between them and dropped to one knee in front of Grace's chair. "Boss," he whispered, and tears were streaming down his face. "I never thought I'd see you again." The ballroom erupted in confused whispers, but Preston didn't seem to notice or care as he took Grace's hands in his, words tumbling out in a rush of emotion. "Freshman year, you were my English teacher at Roosevelt High. Do you remember? I was the angry kid who sat in the back, the one everyone had given up on, the one who'd been kicked out of 2 private schools and was headed nowhere fast." Grace's eyes widened with recognition, her own tears spilling over as she cupped Preston's face with maternal tenderness. "Preston Aldrich," she whispered. "My goodness, look at you, you were so lost back then, baby." Preston nodded, not caring that 300 elite guests were watching him cry at his own wedding reception, not caring that his father was staring in confused horror, caring only that he could finally say the words he'd carried for 15 years. "You've saved my life, Mrs. Coleman," he said, his voice breaking. "When my parents shipped me off to public school as punishment, when everyone saw me as just another rich screw-up. You saw something else. You stayed after school 3 days a week for an entire year, tutoring me, talking to me, believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." Grace was crying openly now, and Marcus felt his own throat tighten as Preston continued. "You gave me the Great Gatsby, and told me that coming from money didn't have to define me, that I could choose to be better than my circumstances. You're the reason I turned my life around, the reason I went to college, the reason I learned that privilege was a responsibility, not a right." Preston stood, helping Grace to her feet, and turned to face the silent crowd, his arm around his former teacher's shoulders. "This woman," he said, his voice ringing clear and strong, "this woman gave me back my future when everyone else had written me off. She never asked for anything, never wanted recognition, just poured everything she had into a kid who'd given her every reason to quit on him." Victoria had joined them now, mascara running down her face, and she took Grace's hand, her voice trembling. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for giving me the man I married, for seeing who he could become." The ballroom remained frozen in shocked silence until Marcus began to clap, a slow, steady rhythm that echoed through the vast space. And then Preston Sr., tears running down his own face as he saw his son clearly, perhaps for the first time, joined in, and then Victoria, and then the applause spread like wildfire until all 300 guests were on their feet, giving a standing ovation to the simple woman in the black dress who'd never sought recognition or reward for changing a young man's entire trajectory. Grace stood in the center of it all, overwhelmed and weeping, and Marcus moved to her side, his arm around her waist, anchoring her through the storm of emotion. Later, after the applause had faded and the reception had transformed into something warmer and more genuine than the stiff formality that had preceded it, Grace and Marcus stood on the estate's terrace, looking out over the gardens as the sun set in brilliant oranges and purples. "I had no idea," Grace said softly. "I taught hundreds of students over the years. You pour your heart into them, and then they move on, and you never know if anything you did mattered." Marcus turned to face her, his hands gentle on her shoulders, his eyes intense with emotion he no longer tried to hide. "It all mattered, Grace," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "Every single moment of kindness, every time you stayed late or believed when others doubted, every sacrifice you made on a teacher's salary, because you cared more about shaping souls than building bank accounts. It all mattered more than anything I've ever built." Grace searched his face, seeing something there that made her breath catch. "Marcus," she started, but he shook his head, needing to finish. "I brought you here thinking I was doing you a favor, thinking I was being some kind of enlightened billionaire by introducing my family to someone real. But the truth is, you've done more for me in 3 weeks than I've done for anyone in years. You've reminded me what actually matters, what real wealth looks like, and Grace." He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You've made me feel less alone than I've felt in a decade." Before Grace could respond, Constance appeared on the terrace. Her usual composure cracked, her eyes red from crying. "Mrs. Coleman," she said formally, then stopped, seeming to struggle with words that didn't come naturally. "I owe you an apology. Judged you based on superficial things, and in doing so, I almost missed meeting the woman who saved my future son-in-law's life." Grace's smile was gentle, holding no resentment. "Mrs. Whitmore, I understand. We all make assumptions based on what we can see. Constance shook her head firmly. That's gracious, but it's not an excuse, she said. And Marcus saw his mother clearly for perhaps the first time, seeing past the social armor to the human underneath. I've spent so long in a world that values the wrong things, and I think. She paused, her voice breaking slightly. I think I've taught my children to do the same, and I'm sorry for that. Marcus reached for his mother's hand, surprised when she gripped it tightly, and in that moment, something shifted in the Whitmore family, a small crack in the foundation of old beliefs that would, over time, allow new understanding to grow. The wedding ended not with the planned spectacular fireworks display, but with Preston and Victoria insisting that Grace join them in the family photographs, and with dozens of guests approaching to thank her for her years of service to public education, and with Preston Sr. writing a check to the Bright Futures Community Center that would fund their arts program for the next decade, gruffly telling Marcus that it was about damn time someone invested in what actually matters. Months later, on a crisp winter morning, Marcus and Grace stood together at the community center's dedication ceremony for its new wing, the Grace Coleman Center for Arts and Humanities, funded by donations from people who'd been at the wedding and had been moved to invest in the kind of quiet, transformative work that rarely made headlines, but changed individual lives in profound ways. Grace had protested the naming, insisting she'd only done her job, but Marcus had been adamant, and eventually, she'd agreed, on the condition that the center's mission statement included a quote she'd lived by throughout her teaching. Career. True wealth is measured not in what we accumulate, but in what we give away, and the richest among us are those who invest in human potential without expecting returns. As they cut the ribbon together, Marcus's hand covering Grace's on the scissors, he leaned close and whispered, "Thank you for teaching me what actually matters." Grace turned to him, her eyes bright with tears and joy and something that looked very much like love. "Thank you for being willing to learn," she replied, and as the crowd applauded and cameras flashed, Marcus Whitmore, the billionaire who'd spent years feeling empty despite his success, finally understood that he'd been searching for the wrong kind of treasure, and that sometimes the most valuable things in life come wrapped in simple black dresses and humble hearts, teaching us that the true measure of a person has nothing to do with their bank account, and everything to do with the size of their capacity to see, to value, and to nurture the potential in others.